Beyond the Horizon by ozjthomas. Buttercup. Once upon a time, in a place not too far from here, there was a man that some would call a hero and some would call a bastard, but all he really was a man. He was walking along the ridges of mountains, searching for his next destination. His eyes were on the mountains to the south, but he wondered what was beyond them as he walked. He had trained in the martial arts, and he still wore his bright yellow monk robes the color of buttercups, even though he had long since left the monastery. This monk, who we will call Buttercup because we do not know his real name, was looking for his place in the world. He was a wanderer, a pilgrim. He had originally entered the monastery after becoming disillusioned with the world of buying, trading, and selling in his late 20s, finding the pursuit of money soulless. And now, after studying religion and martial arts for almost 20 years, he had become disillusioned with that as well, finding these pursuits cut him off from the flow and vitality of life. He wasn't sure where he was going or what he was supposed to be doing. All he knew was that he had to walk in order to get there, and so he just kept putting one foot in front of another. Buttercup was enjoying the warm spring air as he walked along the crest of one particularly tall mountain, reminiscing about all that had happened in his life up to that point. He thought about his time toiling in the rain, selling books door to door. He thought about his long days indoors studying every book in the monastery's library. He thought about how beautiful the temple was in the winter and how sad he was when he heard his father had died. He thought about his other old friends, some still living, some now dead, most of which he knew he would never see again. He was sad, but he continued looking ahead and walking because that was what he had to do for the time being. The wind swept a pair of beautiful yellow and amber leaves past Buttercup's face, and Buttercup looked up to admire them and noticed that he could now see a town down below. He quickened his pace when he noticed the smoke in the fires down below, hoping that he could reach the town in plenty of time to get a late-day meal. When Buttercup walked into the quaint farming village, he noticed the people were watching him very closely. They were all very polite, of course, saying hello and nodding, but they did not say much more than that, and when he walked past a group of them, he noticed they would not stop watching him. Buttercup told himself that they must not be used to strangers, and so he decided not to worry about it and just continue walking, focused on finding his way. Buttercup found the inn and walked inside, where he was greeted by a warm, gentle woman whose smile was so broad that it hid her large eyes. He asked her if he could be served a meal and have a bed, to which she said most certainly, and she set him up with a room, several beautifully woven wool blankets, and a cup of hot tea, and told him supper would be in a few hours. As she showed Buttercup his room, she asked if he really was a monk. Buttercup simply laughed and said that of course he was, and asked why such a question would even be asked. The innkeeper smiled, said that she was merely curious, and then ran off before either he or she could say anything else. A few hours later, Buttercup was relaxing in his room, reading a book, trying to forget the long miles that he had just walked, the uneasiness in his mind and heart, and the long miles that lay ahead. He heard a strange noise on his door, almost a scratching, and he opened it to find several young boys and girls fall into his room. Buttercup was quite surprised at this and asked if the children were all right. The children all laughed nervously, then began to run. The monk leapt ahead of the children and barred them from running out of the inn. "How did you do that?" one child asked, surprised at Buttercup's speed and athleticism. Buttercup smiled and said, "It's not important. What's important is that you tell me why you were listening to me, spying on me." The children hemmed and hawed, and under a lesser man's gaze they likely would not have said anything, but Buttercup's gaze was not like that of others. It was unwavering, and as they started to sweat, one of them began to talk. A boy told Buttercup that they were just trying to figure out if he really was a monk. Buttercup laughed. and with a frown on his face said that of course he was. And since this was the second time someone had asked him this, he began to wonder. The child fidgeted some more, but did not like being stared at, and told Buttercup that the stories they were told said that a monk was going to come and save the village. Buttercup stroked his chin in thought as the children first crept and then ran away. All that evening, through a dinner of cabbage and potato and leek soup, and through a play of puppets, Buttercup was lost in thought. The puppet play was quite funny, by the way. It was a pretty crass tale of a baker being hounded by evil loaves of bread. Buttercup laughed a few times, but was too distracted to really follow the plot closely. He was too engrossed in his own private mystery. He noticed that almost everyone there was watching him more than the play. He suspected that they wanted him to help, but he wasn't sure he wanted to become enmeshed in these people and in this town. He wanted to leave, to focus on his own life and not take any responsibility for the lives of others. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he could not do that. He wanted to leave, to focus on his own life and not take any responsibility for the lives of others. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he could not do that. If he left, and the people suffered somehow because of that, he could never forgive himself. He had to know. He had to understand just why they thought they needed a monk in the first place. And so the next day, Buttercup walked around the town asking the bakers and farmers questions. The people were cagey. Unlike the children, the adults knew how to speak without saying much. So it took a lot of talking, mostly about whose shoes were the shiniest and whose oranges tasted the best before Buttercup deduced that the people here were not as happy as they appeared, mostly because they had to pay terribly high taxes to 7 cruel and greedy warlords. As he walked around, Buttercup could not stop thinking about how he did not want to take sides because he could not see it ending well. He had spent most of his adult life living in a monastery, untangled in politics and the people around him. He knew that it made his life simpler, and almost every instinct in Buttercup's body told him to keep walking, not to get involved with his town and this people because he might just make things worse. Because the people might not tell him the whole truth, and there might be darker things out there than 7 warlords. But he did not want to shy away from life and vitality, and so he felt stuck. He had another filling dinner and spent that evening staring at the stars and thinking. The more he thought, the more his thoughts swirled around in circles, going nowhere, since it seemed obvious to him that he could never be certain that his actions would be for the greater good. Eventually, so tired by thinking, Buttercup simply crashed into his pillow and slept like a rock. When he awoke the next morning, he was determined to help the people of the village. He told the innkeeper, who was ecstatic, although he made sure to tell her that after he protected them, that he would be moving on. The word spread so quickly that by the time the monk walked out of the inn door that morning, a huge crowd of people thanking him were there. He received more handmade hats than he could wear, and more chocolate bread and cheese than he could eat. The people, once cagey and polite, now would not shut up. The monk was polite, reiterating his intent to simply help as they desired and move on, thinking that would be a fair balance between being embroiled in others' lives and action. They thanked him and he bowed, but he quickly walked away as he found the attention unnerving and overwhelming. Over the next few weeks, the monk trained intensely and diligently while waiting for the warlords to come seeking their quarterly tribute tax of food, gold, and wealth. He asked for some space in a barn where he practiced all 5 schools of mystical fighting. The people watched him secretly and prayed that he would be victorious. And then after a few weeks, the warlords came for their taxes. Buttercup went to talk to them, since he believed that fighting should be a last resort. The warlords were a bit confused seeing someone new approaching them, and when Buttercup said the people would not pay their taxes, the warlords were taken aback. They insisted they were simply warriors and the taxes were simply a payment for protecting the people from other tribes and enemies. We only ask that the people pay us enough food to survive and to provide this protection service, the leader told Buttercup. Buttercup heard what he said and he sounded reasonable, this warlord, but he also saw how the people shuddered when the warlords came and he did not trust them, and so he insisted that they leave without payment. The warlords seemed reasonable and sat down to talk for a few minutes, but eventually the patience of the leader wore out, his smile dropped, his sword was drawn, and a fight began. The leader laughed as he engaged Buttercup. One monk. How could one monk defeat 7 warlords? Buttercup blocked the leader's sword with his own and asked the warlords to leave again. They all laughed, but one by one Buttercup cut them down. The leader and his best fighter was the last to go, but he did not die without offering a warning to Buttercup. They used to like us, like they like you now. But be warned, they will grow to despise you too, he said, as Buttercup plunged his sword into the warlord's heart. After the battle, the people cheered and laughed and thanked the monk, remarking that they could now live in peace. The monk was not very happy, as he had just killed 7 people, and told the townspeople he had to be on his way. The people laughed some more, insisting that Buttercup stay, join them in a party and a bonfire. Buttercup simply retired, went to the barn, and cried for the rest of that day. They dragged him the next day, laughing, and paraded him around the town despite his depression. The people insisted that it was his destiny to stay, but the monk was not sure. What if the warlord's remarks were true, and the people would simply start to hate him as they began to despise the warlords? After the party, he was torn. He found himself unable to leave, either because of guilt or misplaced loyalty. Years passed, and the warlord's prophecy that the people would grow to hate him slowly came true. While at first the people were thankful for his protection, as Buttercup discovered all the other tribes and evils of the world that he had to protect the town from, the villagers became angry at having to provide so many weapons and pay so many taxes. Buttercup decided at this time to leave the town for good, to head to the next mountain and look for his place in the world, because he knew it was not in this tiny little town. He did not tell the people he was leaving, because he knew they might kill him if they knew. He simply started walking, now an old man, to that mountain that he had set out for so many years ago. It was another beautiful day.